Welcome back to the Mindful Presenter Truth Series. Truth 27. It's not a good question. Have you ever been to a business presentation? You've sat through the presentation and it's come to that point, that moment, the Q&A session. So the presenter opens it up and says, "Thank you for listening to me. Now we have time for questions," which is not a great way of phrasing it, but we'll talk about that later. But you have a question, and it's a burning question. In fact, it's been something that's been troubling you right throughout the presenter speaking, but it's come to that time where you can get it off your chest. You can ask the question. You think it's a really important and intelligent question. But it takes you a degree of courage, because sometimes in business presentations, it's not easy to put your front foot forward and to stand up and ask a question, because sometimes we're worried about being judged. So you've conjured up the courage to ask a question, you've asked it, and the presenter's answered it. Great, everything's fine so far. Until moments later, somebody else, maybe a couple of rows in front of you, they say, "Yeah, I have a question." They ask their question, and the presenter, the first thing they say might be, "It's a good question," or "That's a really good question." What do you think happens to you if you've had this experience? I know it's happened to me. I've had to find the energy and the courage to share and ask my question. It was just answered, which is absolutely fine, so I'm happy with that. But suddenly, this next person, their question is a really good question. What about mine? Why wasn't mine a good question? Was it a dumb question? Why didn't they acknowledge mine as a good question? If it's happened to you, you'll realize it's really annoying. And it shouldn't be that way. You know why? It's not a good question. Think about it. The presenter's under pressure at this point because it's the moment of truth. If you think about it in the context of they've had days, weeks, sometimes even months to prepare and craft and practice their presentation. They have time to think about questions that may come at them too. But they don't know what's going to come their way, so they have no idea. So at this point, they're very vulnerable. They open up to questions, somebody asks a question, immediately within a nanosecond, they'll say, "That's a good question." It can't be a good question. You know why? Because they haven't even thought about it. They haven't thought about the question. You need to think first and understand the context and the depth and the meaning and the intent behind the question to be able to even say it's a good question. So it's just an autopilot instinctive reaction that they say. So it's probably not true, is it? And how about this as well? It might be that the question, they've kind of sensed that the question is a difficult one or a challenging one, or perhaps they don't even know the answer, but rather than thinking it through, they'll use that time by deflecting, by saying it's a good question. So that gives them just a few moments to think about the answer to the question. But it doesn't work. And if nothing else, my experience in business presentations is when somebody asks a question, often, I was going to say 9 times out of 10, that's probably an exaggeration, but probably 70% of the time, that question's already been answered in the context of the presentation, the content that was shared with the audience. Often it just means that the person wasn't listening or didn't get it, so they asked the question. So it's still not a good question. Does that make sense? It does to me. Don't do it, it's lazy, and it can upset people. Your task as a presenter is to share the content in a rich, compelling, meaningful way to help your audience to feel something. Then, when you open up to questions, answer the question. Just answer the question. Don't preface it by saying that's a good question, it's a really good question, or I'm glad you asked me that, or any of that stuff. It's unnecessary, it's lazy, and it's mindless. Just answer the question, please. Thank you.